June 4, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. 14 days at sea had left Unteroffizier Hermann Buscher's legs unsteady as he stepped off the gangplank. He expected hostility, hatred, perhaps even violence. Instead, through the soft morning haze, he saw something that shattered 3 years of Nazi propaganda in a single glance. American dock workers, white and black, operated cranes side by side. Women in coveralls shouted instructions above the engine's roar. Children sold newspapers at the gates. Nobody screamed. Nobody hid. The prisoners of the Africa Corps, hardened by desert campaigns and indoctrinated by ideology, stared at a society that made no sense to them. Machinery gleamed, jazz spilled from radios, and civilians walked freely through a naval base as if war were a distant rumor. That morning, 2,500 captured Germans set foot on American soil, the first wave of what would grow into more than 425,000 prisoners of war. What they were about to witness across the United States would not be a display of weapons or cruelty, but something infinitely more disarming: freedom itself. The Norfolk Naval Base in 1943 was the beating heart of America's Atlantic war machine, a vast sprawl of steel, cranes and shipyards covering over 4,000 acres. Its docks stretched so far they seemed to merge with the horizon. Every morning, dozens of ships arrived and departed, loading more cargo in hours than Hamburg could handle in a week. But for the men of the Africa Corps who disembarked that summer morning, the shock wasn't the scale. It was the normalcy. Civilians moved freely among uniformed sailors. Vendors sold coffee and donuts in the shadow of destroyers. A brass band played swing music near a war bond rally. To these prisoners, raised under a system that equated strength with fear, America's relaxed confidence was unthinkable. Unteroffizier Hermann Buscher, who would later record his experiences in the memoir Behind Barbed Wire, 1952, described this first moment as a collapse of certainty. His eyes moved from the workers to the American officers who greeted them with fluent German, not for interrogation, but to explain their rights under the Geneva Convention. This was the first impossibility. German military doctrine viewed prisoners as burdens or assets, never as men with dignity. Yet here U.S. officers distributed Red Cross packages, asked about dietary needs, and introduced medical personnel, some of them Jewish Americans, who offered kosher meals to any prisoner who required them. Several German soldiers laughed, thinking it was a cruel joke. It wasn't. The U.S. Army had actually prepared for religious dietary restrictions among its enemies. Medical inspections followed, as thorough as those given to American troops. The International Red Cross confirmed the extraordinary care in a July 1943 report by Swiss Inspector Guy Motreau. Treatment provided to German prisoners equals or exceeds that given to American personnel. African-American medics worked alongside white doctors, another unimaginable sight to men trained in racial hierarchy. One technician, recorded in Norfolk base logs, drew blood from a captured Wehrmacht officer. In Germany, such an act would have been illegal. In America, it was routine. Even the first meal became a moment of quiet disbelief. German POWs entered a mess hall where American sailors were eating lunch. There was no segregation of enemies. The food, roast beef, vegetables, bread, and coffee, came from the same kitchen. The only sound dividing the room was the radio commentary of a baseball game. Nobody stared. Nobody jeered. The Americans seemed almost indifferent to their presence. Over the next 3 days, trains carried the prisoners inland, not in cattle cars, but in cushioned passenger coaches. Civilians gathered at stations to watch the processions. At Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, witnesses recorded families waving goodbye to departing soldiers, while German POWs looked on from nearby cars. On the same platform, children waved flags and teenagers shared milkshakes as their supposed enemies stared in silence. The United States made no attempt to conceal its industrial power from these men. The trains rolled past uncamouflaged aircraft plants, steel mills, and coal mines blazing orange against the night sky. At one stop, prisoners saw the Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Company in Baltimore, its parking lots full of workers' cars, its assembly lines turning out bombers in open daylight. There were no guards shouting orders, no secrecy, no fear. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a German officer watched a factory worker throw away a half-eaten apple and open another. He later wrote that this single gesture, the casual waste of food, was more shocking than any battle he had fought. They had been told America was a land of chaos, of racial collapse and moral decay. What they saw was efficiency without oppression, power without brutality. By the time they reached the vast prisoner compounds being constructed across the South and Midwest, their ideology had already begun to fracture. They expected vengeance. What awaited them instead was a paradox, a nation at total war that refused to act like it. When the trains finally stopped in Texas, the German soldiers saw the second impossibility. The gates of Camp Hearne, just outside the small town of Hearne in Robertson County, opened to reveal not the harsh punishment camps of propaganda, but an organized community. Rows of clean wooden barracks, electrical lights in every building, and water towers rising above tidy gravel roads. The camp covered 720 acres and could hold nearly 5,000 prisoners. It had been built in 1942 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, with a precision and generosity that defied wartime logic. According to records now preserved at the National Archives, every barrack had indoor plumbing, flush toilets, hot water, and electric heating. Each man had his own bed with sheets, blankets, and a mattress. The Germans stared at what looked less like a prison and more like a small American town. Swiss inspector Emil Sandstrom, in his 1943 report, noted, "Conditions at Camp Hearne exceed not only the Geneva Convention, but also the living standards known by many prisoners in their civilian lives in Germany." Commanding Officer Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, a fluent German speaker and former university scholar, greeted the prisoners personally. He explained the rules of conduct and then, to their disbelief, informed them that they would govern themselves inside the camp. They would elect spokesmen, manage their own daily routines, even organize sports, music, and classes. To soldiers bred on total control, this was unthinkable. Freedom, even partial freedom, inside captivity. The camp hospital astonished them further. It possessed modern X-ray equipment, surgical facilities, and the new miracle drug, penicillin, and still unavailable to most German field hospitals. That September, when prisoner Georg Gartner suffered from appendicitis, he was operated on by an American surgeon, assisted by German POW medics. He survived, and decades later, his name would become legend as the last German soldier to surrender, after escaping and living secretly in the U.S. for 40 years. Then came the canteen and the small shop where prisoners could spend camp scrip earned from voluntary labor. Inside were shelves lined with cigarettes, chocolate, notebooks, soap, and even musical instruments. The War Department had authorized these comforts not as generosity, but as psychology. Satisfied men rarely tried to escape. Still, for the Germans, the idea of shopping while captive felt like absurd luxury. By the fall of 1943, America's labor shortage had opened a new chapter for these men. Across Texas, prisoners were assigned to agricultural and industrial work, harvesting cotton, repairing equipment, and loading supplies. They earned 80 cents a day in scrip, the same rate as an American private. The King Ranch near Kingsville became one of the most famous sites. Covering 825,000 acres, larger than the entire state of Rhode Island, it stunned the European mind. Prisoners worked beside Mexican-American vaqueros and black ranch hands, all cooperating under the Texas sun. The racial mixture defied every Nazi principle of superiority. At cotton gins across the state, including in Taylor, Caldwell, and Waller counties, German prisoners watched machines process more cotton in a day than European mills could in a month. Workers took breaks, listened to radios, and joked freely with their supervisors. Productivity through trust, not fear. Efficiency through freedom, not coercion. Letters home, carefully censored but preserved in archives, reveal the growing disbelief. One POW wrote, "Here, workers criticize their government openly, even during war. In Germany, such words would mean death." Indeed, the FBI later reported multiple cases of astonished prisoners overhearing farmers insult President Roosevelt in public without consequence. To them, this unpunished dissent looked like national suicide. But over time, they began to understand. It was democracy in action. Local Texas newspapers chronicled the strange coexistence. The Hearne Democrat published cheerful reports of German prisoners joining community events, helping with harvests, even attending Christmas church services. That December, the same paper recorded the most extraordinary moment yet, a town-wide Christmas drive for the enemy. Churches, schools, and veterans groups gathered gifts for the prisoners, cigarettes, candy, playing cards, and handwritten greetings from children. A 30-foot Christmas tree was erected in the camp, decorated with electric lights that burned through the night. For men who had fought and killed Americans months earlier, the sight was overwhelming. One former Afrika Korps soldier later wrote, "We were defeated on the battlefield, but that night we were conquered by kindness." The Germans had come expecting hatred. What they found was something far more destabilizing to tyranny: mercy backed by power. It was not propaganda that began to dismantle Nazi ideology in their minds. It was the daily experience of freedom, lived, practiced, and extended even to enemies. The transformation that began at Camp Hearne didn't stop there. By 1944, similar camps had appeared across the United States, more than 500 in total, stretching from California's deserts to the rolling farmlands of the Midwest. Together, they held 425,000 German prisoners, the largest population of enemy combatants ever contained on American soil. And everywhere the story repeated itself. Men trained to obey blindly found themselves living inside a system that trusted them to think. Captives of democracy were learning, paradoxically, to be free. The U.S. military understood that wars are fought not only with weapons, but with ideas. Under the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office, officials launched a quiet experiment, one that would later be called the most successful re-education program in history. At Camp Hearne, the seeds of this plan were already sprouting. Prisoners who showed curiosity were invited to attend English lessons. Soon, college professors from nearby Sam Houston State Teachers College began teaching correspondence courses in history, mathematics, agriculture, and American government. Records show that by mid-1944, more than 300 prisoners were enrolled. The camp library grew from a few hundred donated books to more than 5,000 volumes, many of which were banned in Nazi Germany. All Quiet on the Western Front, The Magic Mountain, and works by Jewish authors like Lion Feuchtwanger. To open those pages was to step into forbidden thought. To read freely was to breathe differently. A camp newspaper, Der Spiegel, The Mirror, gave the prisoners a voice. Its early issues, filled with rigid nationalism, soon shifted toward open debate. The evolution was closely monitored by Army psychologists, who noted changes in tone and language, evidence of ideology slowly unraveling. The Special Projects Division divided prisoners into three categories: ardent Nazis, about 15%, non-political, soldiers, roughly 75%, anti-Nazis, around 10%. Each group was handled differently. Anti-Nazis received leadership roles and more privileges. Non-political soldiers were exposed to open discussions, American news, and cultural activities. Hardline Nazis were isolated to prevent intimidation. Every week, officers submitted reports, charting how opinions shifted over time. Subtle but measurable progress from loyalty to doubt, from obedience to understanding. Major Maxwell McKnight, Assistant Executive Officer of the program, later summarized it. After 6 months of exposure to American life and education, more than half of the non-political prisoners displayed measurable movement toward democratic ideals. The process wasn't about propaganda, it was about observation. The Germans didn't need lectures to see the difference between dictatorship and democracy. They could simply watch it unfold around them. Working outside the camps magnified the impact. At the Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, Texas, German prisoners collected scrap metal and saw more aluminum wasted in a day than German factories could obtain in a week. At the Stokely Brothers cannery in Cameron, they were ordered to destroy produce that didn't meet quality standards, perfectly edible food, tossed aside because America could afford perfection. Private Friedrich Miller later wrote in a letter preserved by the Red Cross, "We destroyed hundreds of pounds of fruit because it was not beautiful enough. In Germany, that fruit would feed families." Here, the supervisor apologized for the waste not realizing his apology was for something we could not imagine. Even small encounters reshaped beliefs. At farms near Bryan, Texas, POWs heard farmers curse the government, mock regulations, and argue politics, all without fear. They witnessed wives managing businesses while their husbands served abroad. They saw black and white laborers working side by side, and women flying training aircraft from Bryan Army Airfield as part of the Women Air Force Service Pilots (WASP) program. To men raised under strict gender and racial hierarchies, these moments were disorienting and deeply humanizing. Churches in Hearne, from St. Mary's Catholic to the First Baptist, welcomed German prisoners into their Christmas services. They sat quietly beside mothers whose sons were fighting overseas. No one spat. No one cursed. It was an act of mercy that fractured certainty. That Christmas of 1943, the town of Hearne gave every prisoner a gift. The Hearne Democrat listed each donation, 4,800 packages of cigarettes, candies, and small tokens. The American Legion Post 164, veterans of World War I, donated sports gear for the same men they had once fought against. A choir of American women, some with sons in combat, learned German carols and sang them phonetically at the camp's Christmas Eve service. Among them was Mrs. Sarah Patterson, whose son was fighting in Italy. Guards later recorded that several prisoners wept openly during Stille Nacht. That night's dinner became legendary. Roast turkey, ham, candied sweet potatoes, mince pie, even beer and California wine. A full feast, 5,000 calories per man, while families in Germany survived on ration cards worth less than a quarter of that. It wasn't lost on anyone. For many prisoners, this was the turning point, when victory and defeat ceased to be about armies and became about values. Unteroffizier Hermann Buscher would later write, "Their kindness was not weakness. It was the confidence of a people who knew they had already won, not just the war, but the peace that would follow." By early 1944, the German prisoners' greatest confusion came not from American weapons, but from American contradictions. They had been taught that democracies were weak, undisciplined, and morally corrupt. Yet every day in Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, they watched a country at war behave with calm confidence. They also saw things that didn't fit into any Nazi worldview: freedom alongside inequality, tolerance mixed with hypocrisy, a society imperfect, but alive. At Camp Hearne, guards were sometimes drawn from the 359th Infantry Regiment, an African-American unit. To German eyes, the sight of black soldiers commanding white prisoners was almost unthinkable. Many refused to obey at first. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles documented one report in December 1943. German prisoner objections to Negro guards are noted and ignored. The message was simple: racial superiority held no power here. Yet beyond the camp gates, the same prisoners saw a country struggling with its own divisions. They could walk into restaurants and movie theaters that refused service to the very black soldiers guarding them. In some American towns, enemy prisoners had more social access than American citizens of color. This paradox, that they, as enemies, were treated better than loyal Americans, left a deep mark. And yet, inside the fences, a different truth was visible. Mixed-race work crews, African-American and Mexican-American laborers working beside German POWs. On cotton farms and in rail yards, they learned that productivity had nothing to do with purity. At one documented site near Bryan, Texas, German prisoners picking cotton alongside black workers found themselves outperformed by them. The ideology that claimed racial superiority collapsed under the weight of simple fact. Meanwhile, the Special Projects Division's re-education efforts continued to evolve. Weekly intelligence summaries tracked thousands of subtle shifts. Prisoners who once praised Hitler now argued about democracy. Those who once shunned Jewish authors now quoted Thomas Mann and Erich Maria Remarque. To many Americans, these were just small signs of decency. To the U.S. Army's psychologists, they were data points in a grand experiment. Proof that exposure, not indoctrination, could change the mind of an enemy. Beyond Texas, other camps began to develop reputations of their own. Camp Alva in Oklahoma specialized in agricultural training, teaching modern farming and soil conservation methods that would later help rebuild post-war Germany. Camp Concordia in Kansas became a center for prisoner art and music. Its orchestra, equipped with donated instruments, performed concerts for local audiences. Murals painted by POW artists still decorate Kansas courthouses today. Camp Trinidad in Colorado battled freezing winters, and the Army responded by issuing German prisoners Arctic clothing and extra rations, comforts that even Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front had never known. In each case, American policy seemed designed not merely to confine, but to convince, to show that democracy could afford generosity even to those who had tried to destroy it. That generosity went hand in hand with transparency. Every camp subscribed to American newspapers. Prisoners read headlines openly criticizing the government and the war effort. They heard radio comedians like Bob Hope mock generals and politicians. They watched newsreels debating military failures, industrial shortages, and political corruption. To them, this looked like chaos, until they realized the war continued, undisturbed. America's strength, they began to see, came not from silence but from argument. In 1944, the presidential election made that lesson unavoidable. Germany's Daum propaganda had insisted that democracy could never survive a major war. Yet here was President Franklin D. Roosevelt, campaigning for re-election against Thomas Dewey while American armies fought in France and the Pacific. Newspapers published opposition editorials. Political cartoons mocked the commander-in-chief. Dissent flourished, and the factories kept running. The soldiers kept fighting. To the German military mind, it was madness. To the democratic mind, it was proof. Swiss Red Cross inspectors recorded the prisoners' growing astonishment. In report after report, they wrote that American camps not only met Geneva Convention standards but exceeded them. Better food, better medical care, better living conditions than many U.S. soldiers had in the field. Inspector Guy Montreux's August 1944 assessment was blunt. Americans treat their prisoners not as enemies, but as temporarily displaced persons. It was a philosophical difference that would reshape post-war Europe. And yet, for the German prisoners themselves, the lessons were deeply personal. They worked in factories like Lone Star Steel in Dangerfield, Texas, where production records outstripped anything in the Ruhr Valley before the bombing campaigns. They saw that success wasn't driven by fear but by pride. Workers competed not to survive but to excel. In railroad yards across Texas, prisoners watched ordinary men coordinating massive logistics networks with precision and freedom. There was no central command shouting orders, no party loyalty demanded, just a self-organizing system fueled by ambition and confidence. One German officer later admitted, "It was there in a Texas rail yard that I first understood what freedom really means. It is not disorder, and it is strength." The prisoners began to talk differently, walk differently, even write differently. The rigid salutes softened. The ideological slogans faded. By mid-1944, surveys conducted by American officers showed measurable transformation. Out of thousands of prisoners, the vast majority expressed respect, even admiration, for the society that had captured them. Many began to dream of staying. When the war ended in 1945, some of those dreams would come true, but the full impact of their transformation was only beginning. For what happened next would prove that America's most powerful weapon during the Second World War wasn't a bomb, a plane, or a gun. It was the idea of freedom itself, lived openly, shared without force, and powerful enough to turn enemies into believers. By 1944, the United States had become both a prison and a revelation for the captured soldiers of Hitler's armies. What had begun as disbelief had evolved into introspection. For thousands of German POWs, life behind American barbed wire no longer felt like defeat. It felt like discovery. Each passing month tore another thread from the ideology they had carried across the Atlantic. Their world of order, obedience, and racial purity was dissolving under the steady hum of American freedom. And the breaking point came not with punishment but with kindness that defied logic. Christmas 1943 had been the first crack. 1944 finished the fracture. In Hearne, Texas, the re-education program deepened. The Special Projects Division introduced lectures on democracy, ethics, and responsibility. But these weren't propaganda classes. They were conversations. German soldiers debated American professors face-to-face, unguarded, uncoerced. They read about the U.S. Constitution and realized it wasn't a slogan, but a living structure that even the government itself was bound to obey. To men raised under a regime where the leader was the law, the concept of law above leadership was nothing short of revolutionary. Inside the camp, the German-language newspaper Der Spiegel, not connected to the modern magazine, began printing editorials exploring ideas of freedom, equality, and self-governance. Early editions, full of Nazi clichés, slowly gave way to balanced essays and critical thought. By late 1944, editorials debated women's rights, race, and democracy, subjects that would have meant prison, even death back home. To the American officers observing, this was the moment they'd waited for. The indoctrination was unraveling, not through force, but through experience. Outside the camps, the shock continued. In Texas, German POWs were assigned to cotton and rice farms, food processing plants, and road construction projects. They witnessed firsthand the mechanics of the American economy, a system of organized chaos that somehow worked better than any central command. At the Hearne cotton oil mill, the efficiency was staggering. One day's output there matched what a German mill could produce in an entire month. And yet the atmosphere was relaxed, workers laughing and singing to the radio, taking long lunch breaks. American productivity was not driven by terror. It was driven by motivation. And that realization pierced deep into the minds of men who had been taught that fear was strength. One captured corporal, Friedrich Miller, wrote to his family through Red Cross channels. The Americans live as if war cannot touch them. They waste more than we can imagine, yet they are never short of anything. Perhaps their power comes from the fact that they are not afraid to trust one another. The paradoxes were endless. In towns like Hearne, Bryan, and Caldwell, prisoners saw black workers and white farmers laboring together under the same sun, a sight that would have been impossible under Nazi rule. They met women who ran businesses, taught in schools, and managed entire farms while their husbands were away. At Bryan Army Airfield, the German prisoners saw women in pilot uniform, the women Air Force service pilots. They taxied planes across runways, trained male airmen, and carried themselves with a quiet authority that demolished every myth of female weakness Nazi culture had drilled into them. Later, when the prisoners were questioned by American officers, several admitted that this, not the food, not the comfort, had been the true shock. One wrote simply, "If women can fly airplanes and be respected, then everything we were told is a lie." As spring 1944 turned to summer, the prisoners began to understand that the walls around them were not barriers. They were windows. Through them, they could see a society that was winning the war not by controlling its citizens, but by unleashing them. And then came the final revelation. America's democracy could survive open disagreement. As the U.S. presidential campaign heated up, POWs listened to radio broadcasts where politicians publicly criticized Roosevelt's war policies, while the war was still raging. They read editorials accusing the administration of mismanagement and waste. In Germany, such talk would have meant execution. In America, it was election season. When Roosevelt won his unprecedented fourth term in November 1944, the prisoners had witnessed something no totalitarian system could comprehend. A change in power through debate, not destruction. That realization, quiet and personal, was the true moment of surrender. Yet, the greatest transformation wasn't measured in words or votes. It was in small acts of humanity that left no record but memory. At Camp Hearne's Christmas, celebration of 1944, the American Guards and local townspeople once again provided gifts and a feast. Among the donations was a violin, sent by a mother whose son had died fighting in Europe. She asked that it be played by any German who still remembers music. That night, under strings of electric light, a young prisoner played Silent Night. The sound drifted through the cold air, over the barbed wire and into the Texas dark. Guards listened in silence. In that moment, the line between victor and vanquished blurred. Years later, survivors from both sides would recall it as the night when hate finally died. From Norfolk's docks to Texas's fields, the German prisoners had come expecting retribution. What they found instead was contradiction. A nation that was both flawed and free, divided yet strong, indulgent yet just. It was this contradiction, not ideology, that proved fatal to everything they had believed. They saw that freedom could fight, that democracy could organize, and that mercy could coexist with power. And once they saw it, they could never unsee it. As the final months of the war approached in early 1945, the transformation of Germany's prisoners in America was no longer subtle. It was visible in posture, speech, and behavior. Men who had once barked orders now held doors open. Those who once saluted mechanically began to shake hands. The sharp lines of hierarchy that had defined the Wehrmacht softened into something unrecognizable: mutual respect. At Camp Hearne, Camp Concordia, and dozens of others, American officers noted the same pattern: ideology fading, curiosity rising. When news of Germany's collapse reached Texas that May, some prisoners wept, not for the Reich, but for the homes they knew would now lie in ruins. Others stood in silence, unsure how to process defeat that had already begun inside them long before Berlin fell. The end of the war did not immediately mean freedom. The prisoners remained in the U.S. while Allied authorities decided their fate. But the time was not wasted. The War Department, recognizing an opportunity, launched programs to prepare these men for a democratic Germany. Under the Special Projects Division, vocational courses expanded. 31,000 POWs enrolled in trades like engineering, medicine, and agriculture. 18,000 studied English, while others took classes in public administration, civic responsibility, and modern farming techniques. The U.S. Army had already realized that post-war peace would depend not just on occupation, but on education. Prisoners read about the plans that would soon become the Marshall Plan, America's promise to rebuild Europe, not to punish it. They were told that Germany's recovery would depend on free cooperation, not forced obedience. For men who had seen America's abundance firsthand, the open factories, the endless farmland, the trust that powered it all, the logic was clear. This was not propaganda. It was evidence. Swiss Red Cross inspectors who continued to visit the camps documented the conditions in meticulous reports. By every measure, food, medical care, living space, education, American camps exceeded international standards. One inspection in mid-1944 recorded an average daily caloric intake of 3,300 to 3,800 calories per prisoner, nearly double what German civilians received at home. Each camp provided a doctor for every 500 men, twice the required ratio. Inspector Emil Sandstrom concluded, "Having inspected camps in Canada, Britain, and Australia, I can state definitively that American facilities are superior. The distinction is not only material but philosophical. The Americans treat prisoners as men to be returned to the world, not as enemies to be destroyed." That philosophy would ripple across post-war Europe. Work programs also continued after victory. At the Lone Star Steel plant in Texas, production remained high as German prisoners labored beside American civilians, now not as enemies but as partners. They loaded trains, assembled parts, and marveled at the freedom of American industry. There were no overseers with whips, no slogans on the walls, no portraits of leaders staring down from above. Instead, they saw workers competing to improve processes, suggesting innovations and taking pride in personal craftsmanship. To German eyes, trained in obedience, this self-directed energy looked chaotic. To American eyes, it was normal. The same lessons unfolded in rail yards across the South. At the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad Yard in Smithville, prisoners saw dispatchers coordinating trains with astonishing precision, all without military command. Telegraph operators, switch crews, and clerks worked as equals in a machine of voluntary order. One German lieutenant confessed in a post-war interview, "In that yard, I saw how a nation without fear can still be disciplined. It was then I understood. Freedom is the most efficient system of all." By the summer of 1945, the statistics told the story of how completely the German POWs had adapted. Of 425,000 prisoners held in the United States, only 2,022 escape attempts were, recorded only 54 remained free longer than 30 days. There were just 7 confirmed cases of sabotage. Over 87% of eligible prisoners volunteered for labor programs, numbers that reflected not captivity, but cooperation. When the time came to repatriate them, American officials conducted surveys on ideology and attitudes. The results were astonishing. Percent of the returning POWs expressed favorable opinions of American democracy. 61% supported the upcoming Marshall Plan. 55% favored a future alliance with the United States. 38% said they would emigrate to America if allowed. In the years that followed, many did. More than 5,000 former POWs legally immigrated to the United States during the 1950s. Over 90% became citizens. They integrated into the American workforce, married, and built lives that mirrored the freedom they had once resisted. Others returned to a devastated Germany, but they carried the memory of America with them. Dozens entered politics in the new Federal Republic of Germany. 48 became members of the Bundestag. Hundreds more served as mayors, teachers, and engineers. They rebuilt cities and industries using methods they had learned while in captivity: democratic management, efficiency through cooperation, productivity through fairness. In 1965, one former prisoner, Hans-Georg von Studnitz, summarized it simply: "We returned from America with more than memories. We brought back the blueprint of a better Germany." Camp Hearne officially closed in December 1945, but its story didn't end there. The people of Hearne kept in touch with their former captives through letters and Christmas cards that continued for decades. When the last known German POW who had lived there died in 2001, the Hearne Heritage League still held his correspondence, proof that bonds formed through decency had outlived the war itself. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, 50 former German prisoners returned to Texas. The Hearne Democrat covered the reunion extensively. Old men who had once worn the eagle of the Wehrmacht embraced the Americans who had guarded them. They laid flowers at the American Legion Memorial, stood for the Star-Spangled Banner, and spoke of gratitude instead of guilt. Fritz Zimmermann, speaking for the group, told the gathered crowd, "We came as enemies believing in destiny and racial superiority. We left as friends understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength, and that freedom, though imperfect, is worth everything." The applause that followed wasn't patriotic. It was human, because by then everyone there understood that America's quiet victory hadn't been won on the beaches of Normandy or the ruins of Berlin. It had been won right there, behind barbed wire, in the hearts and minds of men who had seen the truth and could never unsee it. When the war ended, America's camps emptied slowly. Ships departed from New York, Virginia, and New Orleans, carrying men who were no longer the same soldiers who had arrived. What returned to Germany in 1946 and 1947 was not the Afrika Korps that had once marched under Hitler's son, but a generation that had stared directly into the working heart of democracy and found it stronger than any dictatorship. Across the ruins of Germany, these men stepped back into a homeland unrecognizable from the one they'd left. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden lay in rubble. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The Reich they had been told would last 1,000 years had lasted barely 12. And yet, those who had been prisoners in America carried something that no ration book could measure: an understanding of how freedom worked. They had seen industries run without terror, societies survive without censorship, and communities thrive without fear. In American fields and factories, they had learned more about rebuilding than destruction, lessons that would soon become vital. The U.S. occupation authorities quickly realized that these repatriated soldiers could play a critical role in reshaping Germany. Many were interviewed, assessed, and placed into administrative or technical positions to help restore public life. In the early 1950s, historians began to notice a striking trend. Former prisoners of war from American camps, particularly those from Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, were disproportionately represented in the new West German civil service, agricultural programs, and education systems. Records from the Bundesarchiv confirm it. 8 became members of the Bundestag, Germany's new federal parliament, when served as mayors or city councilors. Over 4,000 entered business or industry, applying American-style management techniques. Nearly 2,000 became teachers or professors, spreading democratic ideas to a generation that had known only dictatorship. These were not accidents. They were consequences of exposure, the slow but irreversible effect of having seen the strength of an open society. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, gave form to what many of these former POWs already understood. The United States was not interested in vengeance, but in recovery. Food shipments, machinery, and financial aid poured into Europe. To Germans who had once been enemies, it was a gesture almost impossible to believe. And yet, those who had lived in America understood it instinctively. They had seen the same logic in Texas farm fields. The belief that helping others prosper strengthened everyone. Some became vocal advocates for American partnership. Others joined the growing movement for European integration, planting the seeds of what would eventually become the European Union. The cultural influence went even deeper. Former prisoners who had worked on ranches and in factories brought back new ways of thinking about teamwork, efficiency, and personal responsibility. They introduced democratic decision-making into workplaces that had once run on command and obedience. One such man, Hans-Georg von Studnitz, who later became an industrialist, told historians in 1965. In America, we saw how a people can argue, disagree, and still build together. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked. For many, the proof of transformation wasn't in politics, but in personal choice. Over 5,000 German POWs legally immigrated to the United States in the 1950s. They built new lives in the country that had once held them captive. They married, raised children, and quietly contributed to the post-war boom. Among them were Hermann Buscher, Georg Gärtner, and Reinhold Pabel, each carrying a story that mirrored the journey of thousands of others. Buscher, who had once stepped off a ship in Norfolk believing every American was an enemy, became a U.S. citizen in 1958 and worked as an engineer for General Motors. Gärtner, who escaped in 1945 and lived under a false identity for 4 decades, eventually turned himself in and wrote Hitler's Last Soldier in America, a memoir that revealed not hatred but gratitude. Pabel, who escaped from Camp Washington in Illinois and lived illegally in Chicago, married an American woman and ran a bookstore. When discovered years later, he was granted citizenship, not punishment, because his only crime had been the desire to live free. Each story was a mirror reflecting the same truth. Captivity in America had not humiliated them. It had humanized them. By the 1960s, historians began to recognize that the German POW experience in the United States represented something unprecedented in warfare, a mass ideological transformation achieved not through propaganda, but through reality. Dr. Arnold Kramer's Nazi, Prisoners of War in America, 1979, would later call it the most successful re-education through exposure ever conducted. The American method had been simple but radical. Treat men as human beings, and let freedom do the rest. The results rippled outward. The West German state that emerged from the ashes bore little resemblance to its authoritarian predecessor. Its democratic institutions were resilient. Its society, skeptical of extremism, and its people determined never again to surrender conscience to command. And among the builders of that new democracy were thousands of men who had once stood on the opposite shore, who had crossed the Atlantic as soldiers of tyranny and returned as quiet ambassadors of freedom. The war's shadow stretched long after 1945, but for thousands of German prisoners, America had already rewritten their understanding of the world. Long before the Cold War divided continents, the seeds of a new alliance had been planted in the fields and factories of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. It was there, behind the barbed wire of places like Camp Hearne, that former enemies began to see the foundations of partnership. The POW camps had been designed for control, yet they became classrooms of democracy, workshops of tolerance, and test grounds for the power of decency. When the last camps closed in late 1945, many guards and locals didn't celebrate. They wrote letters. For years afterward, towns like Hearne received postcards from Germany signed simply, "Your former prisoner." The correspondence became a quiet tradition. Every Christmas, cards arrived written in careful English or German, thanking the people who had once guarded them for kindness shown in a time of war. Some included photos of families, farms rebuilt, or small businesses flourishing, proof that the lessons of freedom had taken root far from American soil. The Hearne Heritage League still preserves dozens of those letters, spanning nearly half a century. In one, a man named Otto from Bavaria wrote, "You treated us as men, not as enemies. When I rebuilt my house, I built it with open windows and to remind myself never to live behind walls again." In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, those memories came full circle. 50 former German POWs returned to Texas, some traveling across the Atlantic for the first time since the war. The Hearne Democrat chronicled the event in detail. The arrival of old men who once wore the eagle and swastika, now gray-haired and soft-spoken, stepping onto American soil not as prisoners but as friends. They visited the grounds where Camp Hearne had stood. The barracks were long gone, the fields overgrown with wild grass. But the memories remained sharp. The smell of Texas cedar, the hum of trains passing at dusk, the laughter from the camp's canteen. At the town square, the visitors laid flowers at the American Legion Memorial and stood in silence. Then, as the American flag was raised, one of them, Fritz Zimmermann, spoke for them all. "We came here as enemies," he said, "believing in superiority and destiny. We leave as friends, understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength, that freedom, though messy, is the truest order." His words echoed what countless others had discovered in those strange years. That America's greatest weapon had never been its arsenal, but its example. The story of the German POWs in America remains one of history's quiet miracles. No mass re-education camps, no forced indoctrination. Only exposure to an idea that could not be unseen once experienced. The statistics, now archived in the National Archives and the International Red Cross, tell a story unmatched in modern warfare. Over 425,000 prisoners held. Fewer than 0.5% attempted escape. Incidents of violence were almost non-existent. Rates of cooperation and voluntary labor exceeded 87%, and when these men returned home, the ripple was unmistakable. Post-war surveys by American occupation officials found that nearly 3/4 of returning POWs expressed sympathy for democratic governance. Within a decade, they became some of West Germany's most reliable defenders of freedom. Historians would later call this phenomenon re-education by reality. It worked not because it was forced, but because it was lived. In the end, the unusual sights that stunned those German soldiers, black and white workers sharing a crane, women piloting aircraft, civilians criticizing their leaders without fear, proved more powerful than any propaganda leaflet or victory parade. Those moments, ordinary to Americans but revolutionary to the products of totalitarianism, changed the course of nations. The POWs had come expecting enemies. They found mirrors instead, reflections of what a society could become when it trusted its people more than its rulers. And in that reflection, they saw the outline of their own future. In the grand story of the Second World War, history remembers the great battles, Stalingrad, Normandy, the Bulge. But one of America's quietest victories never happened on a battlefield. It happened behind fences, under Texas skies in classrooms in cotton, fields where captured soldiers learned what their own empire had tried to destroy: the simple power of human dignity. The German prisoners arrived in the United States as believers in strength through fear, in order through domination, in purity through exclusion. They left with the understanding that freedom's strength comes from the opposite, from trust, from tolerance, from the untidy equality of democracy. America was imperfect. They saw its contradictions clearly: segregation beside liberty, inequality beside opportunity. Yet even those flaws told a truth the Nazis had hidden: that self-correction, not control, is the secret to endurance. For every prisoner who marveled at an American factory or shared a meal with a stranger, the revelation was the same: a nation could be powerful without being cruel. And that realization didn't just change individuals. It changed the world that followed. The men who once fought under the swastika returned home carrying invisible cargo: new ideas about leadership, responsibility, and coexistence. Those ideas became the foundation stones of West Germany's democracy and, in time, the bridge across the Atlantic that would define the modern alliance between former enemies. No propaganda campaign could have achieved what a few years of fairness did. No victory parade could have inspired the gratitude born from simple decency. When the last of those prisoners died, the letters from Texas stopped. But the legacy remained, written not in stone, but in culture, politics, and memory, because in the end, the most unusual sights those men witnessed weren't the machines or the music, the abundance or the freedom. It was the sight of mercy in the hands of power. And in that sight, they discovered a truth more enduring than victory itself, that the greatest triumphs in war are not measured by conquest, but by compassion.